Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Dr. Jeanet Bentzen. Hello, Jeanet. How are you doing?
Hello, Lipton. I'm good. How are you?
I'm great, Jeanet. Jeanet, how does one write these fascinating papers? I've been following your work. You have covered a wide facet of topics from religion to irrigation to culture.
Yes, well, I guess I'm really driven by my curiosity. I guess that's any researcher is. So whenever there's something I find extremely exciting or something that I don't understand, I well dig in and try to look at it more and from various different angles.
Yes, and we're going to be talking about a paper you published a few years ago, and this paper is groundbreaking because it confirms an old assumption, the relationship between irrigation and autocracy. Tell us a little about the history of your research.
Yeah, so that paper we test some very old hypotheses about a relation between a certain type of agriculture, namely irrigation, and how this can influence institutions, and in particular that irrigation societies may grow into these very strong and autocratic regimes where the elite is in control, and the peasants are close to uh, well, in some places slaves. Yeah.
And why would one conceive of a link between irrigation and autocracy?
Yeah, so the idea is that if we, for example, compare two types of societies, one is based where the agriculture is based on rain from the sky, and another society where the only way you can get water on your fields is through irrigation. Well, then in the first society, the individual small peasant, he or she can get water quite easily, and without being dependent on any resources or any persons with resources. Whereas in the irrigation dependent society, if you cannot get any water on your field without cooperating or well, being the serf of some elite who owns the water. And that's the problem, that irrigation societies, there you can actually have people who own the water. And in rain-fed societies, you cannot own the water falling from the sky, of course. So there we will then see that these rain-fed societies, they grow into more equal societies where small individual peasants, they own their land and they have their own rights, whereas in irrigation societies, we get these very unequal societies where few people own lots of resources.
Thanks for this splendid explanation. Jeanette, I have to recant. I read your paper thoroughly, but during my previous interview with Omar Ozak, I said that there is a relationship between irrigation and autocracy, and Turkey is listed, but Turkey does not have a history of irrigation. So I made an error. So I'm just recanting.
Yeah, yeah. So what it's so good that you mentioned, but it's so crucial that we are certainly not saying that this link between irrigation and democracy is the only thing that determines democracy or not.
Yeah.
There is, of course, lots of different factors.
Yeah, and in your article, you compared Turkey to a country with a history of irrigation, and you argue that this explains a percentage of the variation in institutional quality between Turkey and that country.
So I'm not sure what after, so in our analysis we use data for, I don't recall, maybe 170
Yes,
countries.
several
So it's
countries.
a,
That's why I didn't call the name because I don't remember at the moment.
yeah, so it's not about Turkey. It's about, well, I'm sure you know, but yeah. So I just want to stress that it's so we have one part of the analysis where it's correlations between across 170 countries, I think, across the globe, and we can then measure whether they had a past of irrigation potential. So the idea is not that we are actually not measuring actual irrigation. We are measuring the potential to irrigate, because there is an indigeneity problem. There is a problem if we just look at the correlation between democracy and historic irrigation. Well, then we would also include in that correlation this tendency for maybe for autocratic regimes to be better able at constructing irrigation works. And so we would then capture this reverse causality. And therefore we look at the potential to irrigate. So that's based on the Food and Agriculture Organization's measures of. So if you take one plot of land on the earth, then how much can extra water increase the yields in this place? So it's a purely geographic calculated measure. Yeah, and the idea is, so I also want to stress that when I say irrigation here, I mean historic irrigation and not like modern sprinkler irrigation and these things. We do not expect that these current novel irrigation types based on sprinkler irrigation, they would influence institutions at all. So what we're thinking of is these big historic irrigation works where you needed to dig big canals and were dependent on this huge cooperation between or submission of the labor that could construct these big canals. Is
Exactly.
that the answer to a question?
Yes, yes. You're shedding light on controversial topics. So on this show, Jeanette, I like to be accurate. We all make errors, but I don't like to make errors. That's not good for the reputation of the guest or for the show.
No.
So I had to clear up these issues. Please tell
Cool.
us a little bit more about the relationship between the legacy of irrigation potential and support for autocratic regimes.
Yeah. So what we then you mean the historical background, the mechanism? Yeah, yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
because you see that people in these countries, they're skeptical of democracy.
Yes. So yeah. Almost. So what we find is that these societies based on historic irrigation, they are more likely to emerge into current autocracies. And also in the past, we can see that they were they got autocracy. But you could also turn it around and say that they were less likely to get democracy. And maybe that's more clear because in these societies with irrigation, we saw these huge, the resources gathered in very few people, a landed elite who owned these resources. And if you are rich and elite with lots of resources, you would probably not like to get rid of this wealth and power. So we see in these societies that the elite were more likely to fend off waves of democratization and hang on to institutions that secured their power. So that's one explanation for why we see these irrigation societies being more likely to be autocratic today. Also, and similarly, we see that when the elite is in so much power, and the peasants are not. The peasants are not as able to demonstrate and to demand equal rights. Because they're so dependent on this water resource by the elite. So we see these both mechanisms at work, and we can then also look into the data and not just look at current democracy, but also see that these past societies were more unequal in the past, or they were it was the case that in irrigation societies, then the land was well gathered on the hands of a small landed elite.
Yes, I was just about to ask you to explore the link between land inequality and irrigation.
Yeah, and that's a very, well, it's an important part of the analysis, because at first we don't know why there is a link between irrigation and democracy. So we dig into the data and look at the historic mechanisms at work, and we can well, see this link. So these data are some cool data gathered by ethnographers, about 1,200 societies. They have been out and measured the different factors in these societies, and one of these factors is that they're noted down. So these societies are either current societies or past societies that were not affected by modern people, so isolated from modernity, and they noted down that some of, like the resources in these societies, were they owned by well, a landed elite, and that's or were they owned by everybody, and so on. So that's what we base our analysis on. And the cool thing about that is that we can also, so one thing is that we can look in the past and see that irrigation affected the inequality, but we can also exclude variation across societies and look at small societies within countries. And that's a pretty powerful tool, so we can get rid of all these other factors that, of course, also influence inequality. Yeah.
Jeanet, I see it's evident that we're equally passionate about this paper.
Cool.
Yeah, so Jeanet, you were comparing Turkey to Algeria, because your article is in front of me, and earlier I said that you were comparing Turkey to a country. So for our guess, the country is Algeria.
I'm not sure I understand that question,
No,
actually.
it's not a question, Jeanet. I said earlier, I said that you were comparing Turkey to Algeria because I didn't remember the name of the country. So I'm saying that the country is Algeria.
Okay.
Yeah, the irrigation potential. I'm
Yeah.
just making it clear for the guests because I didn't remember the name of the country. So in case people would like to know the name of the country is Algeria.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, that's just for clarification purposes. Jeanet,
Okay.
page 9 of your paper is really important, and I'm going to read it. Resource
Okay.
abundance may, however, be compatible with good institutions if the resource owning elite faces opposition from other special interest groups. That is one reason why the resource curse is mostly observed in developing countries with little economic activity outside their primary sectors. Another reason why resources rarely are occurs in developed countries is that many subsoil resources have been discovered within the past century, when many developed countries already had developed institutional constraints on the elite. For instance, oil discoveries in the North Sea have not turned Norway into an authoritarian country, just as oil discoveries in Texas and the Mexican Gulf have had little impact on institutions in the United States.
Yes.
Excellent. Yes. Resource curse.
Yeah, so it's so that links very much to earlier work by Sokolov and Engerman, which is quite important in this in this research, where they also find this these resource abundant states. Well, this is in the Americas, where they look at states that had that were reliant on these expensive crops like sugar, for example, or coffee, and there they see this reversal. So these societies that had these resources in the past, before modern institutions, they became richer in the past, but at some point it turned around when institutions became more important for well, economic development and lots of other things, but this is economic development. And then it turned around. So these societies that were resource abundant, they grew poorer over time. Yeah, and that's similar to ours.
And Jeanet, there is a growing school of research looking at the nexus between a certain agricultural crops and the propensity for slavery. And wheat does not seem to have a clear relationship between slave production. Wheat owning areas tend to be more individualistic and less likely to invest in slavery.
Yes, exactly. And that's the opposite side of the coin that I just talked about. So that's again, well, wheat is related to slavery, but negatively related.
Yeah.
So in these societies that were based on wheat, it's kind of similar to the rain story, actually, because wheat is not as expensive, and the individual peasant, he or she could make his own or her own harvest, and not be having to conduct these big investments in these more expensive crops that were better on big plantations. Wheat could be on small fields, just as rain-fed agriculture. So it has very similar effects.
And Jeanette, when I was reading your article, I was struck by the fact that your studies were actually disconfirming the so-called link between Islam and autocracy.
Yes, well, we kind of, but what we can see is that the link between irrigation and autocracy is also there if we restrict to either Muslim countries or non-Muslim countries.
Yes, but Muslim countries are not necessarily autocratic because they're Muslim. I think this is a crucial point.
And that's very crucial. Yes, we dismiss that.
Yeah, and I found that striking because in the mainstream media, there's the leitmotif that Muslim countries are autocratic because autocracy is embedded in the philosophy of Islam. And Jeanette, in your article, you also explain why irrigation policies in America won't lead to autocracy. Could you shed some more light on this development for us, please?
Yes. So well, maybe we're back a little bit to the type of irrigation. So well, it's important that it's only these big historic irrigation works that can lead to autocracy. Well, at least according to these mechanisms here. So current sprinkler irrigation would not create these inequality. Furthermore, so that's one response, and the other response is that in modern US there is already these institutions that secure that one group of population or few individuals, they cannot grasp so much power as they could in the past. So now we already have these institutions, and that experiment would not result in autocracy to the same extent today. Yeah.
Yes, it's just like oil. America wouldn't become a modern petrostate because, as you rightly note, in contrast to oil extraction, irrigation is an old technology mastered in ancient Mesopotamia. So few nations, if any, had institutions that provided checks and balances on the ruling elite when irrigation was first introduced.
Yes. exactly.
But Jeanette, your paper has immense potential. I don't know if you're seeing this because you could do another paper on the relationship between ancient versus modern technologies and their potential for autocracy or innovation.
That is true. That is another more general, yeah, ancient versus modern. Yeah, and but I guess the well, the crucial point here is whether it's a point source resource or point source in technology, where you can own it well, a few people can own it in that way. Yeah.
Yeah. And as someone who is interested in free market economics, I'm wondering what will be the consequences of privatizing waters and streams, for example? Would it lead to competition or would it ensure that capitalists earn monopoly rents?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. So privatizing uh, water and springs, that doesn't sound so good. Um, I have no idea what that would result in,
Yeah,
but
it could
it
either lead to
sounds
competition or
chaotic
yeah,
and bad.
it could either lead to competition or monopoly rents. So it all depends on the dynamics and we can't comment until we try it.
Exactly. Yes, we don't know beforehand. No.
But privatizing roads, that's a policy that I can work out in my mind because we use the road and I'm accustomed to the notion of a toll. But when you privatize waterways, how do you deal with the contractual system? Is the business person leasing the water to private companies so that they can sell it? These issues are very contentious.
Yes, for sure. Yes.
But Jeanette, since we're on the history of autocracy and modern development, as an economist, do you, well, I won't say you, but the field, people in the field, do they know why autocracy is so persistent in some cultures? Do we have data on the topic?
Well, there's lots of research on the persistence of democracy or any institution. Huh? It's I'm really fascinated by the topic why institutions persist and well, one factor is geography. Well, for example, where irrigation is one example, and these the resource curse more generally. One example, but yeah. So geography of all, there's also other papers on rainfall, another type of geography that affects. But then there's also another big group of factors that can explain this persistence, which is cultural values that are also very, very slow moving, and so to the extent that cultural values they impact institutions, this may also explain the persistence of institutions.
Yes, and in your paper, you cite some numerous studies examining the different types of cereals and how they affect modern development. You're more familiar with this line of research than I am.
Yeah, so different crops of different types of resources. Yeah, so oil we talked about, and well, diamonds and these different crops. Yes, for example, well, sugar, coffee. Are examples of crops that lead to persistence of autocracies, or on the other hand, wheat, which well, is the reverse side of the coin that leads to persistence, perhaps, of democracy, because in these, let's start with the wheat. In these societies, the reason why we see persistence is that the population more broadly gets these, well, economic power, but then also political power to say that, hey, we want these more equal institutions that benefit us all. And once you have these equal institutions in place, it's more difficult to overturn them. We have, of course, seen various examples where you can overturn democracy and move to autocracy instead, but it's more difficult once they are in place. Once the population has power, it's difficult to take it away from them. And on the other hand as well, once these ruling elite have all the power, it's difficult to take it away from them.
Yes, and Jeanette, in your research, you also controlled for democracy. So please explain to me and the viewers, why was democracy as a variable assessed in your paper? And I'm talking about your statistical analysis when you are controlling for various factors like democracy, religion, and colonialism.
I'm not sure what you are asking about here. So in the paper, we have as our dependent variable, we have democracy. So we look at the impact of irrigation potential on democracy. And of course, we are concerned that there's just other factors that make countries democratic and also correlate with being rain-fed or irrigated. So therefore, we control, for example, for GDP per capita, or for, as you say,
Colonialism.
Colonialism, yes. So there the concern would be that being a former colony is what drives our results, and we don't find that this explains much.
Yes, there is a really captivating literature on the long run determinants of colonialism. I'm a bit skeptical, and I'm not skeptical of the data, I'm skeptical of the framework, because based on my reading of history, even without colonialism, many of these countries would have invested in extractive institutions anyway, because prior to colonialism, their institutions were already extractive.
Yeah, so there's I guess you could split it up in two and say that, well, your current institutions, they are affected by, well, your own development and your own past institutions, and then also what happened, well, whether you were a colony or not. I have some other work where we also look at democracy and find that yes, these historic or these or countries across the globe, whether or not they have democracy, it's affected by whether they had democracy in the way past, and also after controlling for colonial, whether they were a colony or not, and that's very crucial to control for, because these colonizers, they did come with institutions. Some were very bad and extractive, and some may have been much better and beneficial for current democracy. So it's quite crucial. But again, so the impact of institutions by the colonizers can still be there, but at the same time also that our institutions are affected by our own, so to speak, past institutions. So both of these effects can be there.
Yes, Jeanette, you actually have a paper on this topic detailing Africa. The indigenous roots. You have a paper
Yes.
on the topic, the indigenous roots of democracy.
Yes, exactly. Yes, and in that paper we find that current democracy is affected by the past democracy of small groups living in these countries in our ancient history, but it's not all the groups that affect current democracy. Interestingly, it's only the stronger groups that leave this legacy for current democracy. I find that really interesting to think about what happened to the small groups that were not as powerful, and these bigger groups ended up, so their institutions ended up impacting our history much more than the smaller groups.
Maybe the taste for democracy was more saturated in the stronger groups. This could be an explanation.
The taste for democracy was more saturated. Is
In
that
the
what you say?
yeah, in the stronger groups, because they were more effective. They had a longer time to inculcate reverence for democracy.
Maybe, but we find it both ways. So if these bigger groups or richer groups, when I say groups here, it's not the landed elites, it's societies. So if there were small societies that were bigger, their way of doing things survived to today, and that's both doing things the democratic way or the autocratic way. So it goes both ways. Yeah.
Yeah, I get your point quite clear, because if you're bigger society that's also autocratic, you can inculcate reverence for autocracy. So you're right, the pendulum may swing in either direction.
Yes.
Jeanet, as an expert in the arena of economics and cultural values, what values best explain economic development?
Ooh, I cannot answer that question, but what I've been doing research on is religion. But that's not to say that religion or religiosity influences current democracy the most, but it's an important factor among many.
Yes, and you have a recent paper, I believe it's a 2021 paper published by an institution associated with Oxford. Shed some light on this research.
Yeah, so well, that paper is a review paper where I do a literature review on the field, which is called economics of religion, which I do lots of research in myself, but I also have there's also lots of cool researchers across the globe doing much research on economics of religion. And in that paper, it's mainly economists that the economics literature that I survey. And so the field called economics of religion, it's a field where we use economic methods to study causes and consequences of religion. And what I'm very fascinated about is the degree of religiosity. So not just whether you're a Muslim or not, but how strong a believer you are. So how strong a Muslim you are, or how strong a Christian you are, and that's what I survey in that paper. And what fascinates me is trying to think about and trying to look empirically at how is it then that religiosity influences society, and why is it that some societies are more religious than others?
Yeah,
So
we're
these
going to get
two
to that soon, but
questions.
before we
Yes.
get to this point, when is religion favorable to development?
Yeah, so we can if we think of, it depends on which dimension of religion you look at, and so I like to think about religion and as having these different dimensions. For example, one is that you go to public services, church services, and when you go there, you get different goods or bads. So one good is that you socialize with fellow believers, and that may increase your social capital. You trust, so empirical research finds that you trust more in other believers of the same religion. When you go to church, you also get some a social view that you shouldn't work, or you should work hard. For example, in some religions, you also get other social views. So you get positive and negative social views. One more negative is a more traditional view on gender roles. There is research finding these negative correlations between religiosity and equality of gender roles. But then, yeah.
No, you may go ahead.
Okay, so we're still listing all the dimensions. So yeah, so that's going to church. Another dimension of religion is your personal beliefs, and that may provide you with the comfort by believing in a God, which is well, it's good for stress relief. There's lots of research on that. And a last dimension of religion is, for example, so there's others, but let's just take these. And another dimension is that unfortunately rulers can exploit religion for power purposes. So remaining again in talk about autocracy, that there is a tendency that these countries with a strong, with a past of where religion had a strong role, well, in these societies were more likely to develop into autocracies because rulers could say, well, follow my rules because God says so. And no need to fend off power to legitimize it. Yeah, so that's just some of the examples of how religiosity could influence various different societal factors.
Jeanet, I think it's
Yeah.
time for you to surprise my listeners by telling them about the pre-Reformation roots of the Protestant work ethic.
Yes, so that's another paper of mine. Yeah. So there we looked at a type of religion. So what I just said was religiosity to the degree of believing. So there it's a type of religion. Yeah. So we look at the Cistercian monks, and actually Max Weber himself, he mentioned these monks as being particularly hardworking, and so they were a group of monks that wanted to devote more time to prayer, and therefore they refrained from useless consumption, for example, of arts or pets, and they made sure to work hard when they worked. That way they could get more time for their religious endeavors. And we do see that in these places with the more Cistercian monks in the past, they ended up growing more, so having more higher economic growth.
Yes, the Cistercian monks were workaholics. Jeanette, we're still on the topic of religion. Some time ago, I read a study saying that religious people, sorry, Christians, were actually more likely to save than believers, but Jewish people, they were the wealthiest of all groups. The study was published some time ago. I read it online. I don't remember the name of the writers at the moment, but was looking at the relationship between religion and economic growth. And I think that one of the reasons why some religious beliefs are associated with economic growth is because they emphasize saving.
Yeah, so this is this is again some certain types of religion. I'm actually not sure I know about this study, but yes, there's been lots of research on how different types of beliefs can influence development differently. So beliefs in or social views of hard work or saving. Yes, that's been shown to influence economic matters.
And then there is always the Calvinist position that excellence is evidence of God's favor. So if you're a serious Christian, you ought to be an excellent academic, business executive, talk show host, whatever it is that you choose to excel at.
Could be, yes. But there's other recent research showing that maybe it's not just the types of religion, but rather the degrees of believing that actually matters. And yes, as you just said, that maybe this link between Christianity and saving, maybe that's due to some Christian groups being more religious than others, or Jewish groups being more religious than other groups.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Like
it
I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Charles Webster, but he argues that religious groups, because they were preparing for the reign of Christ on earth, they were compelled to work harder because they wanted that reign to be superior. So it led them to study science and take experiments more seriously.
Yeah, that's one hypothesis.
But now, Jeanette, we're going to talk about your paper. Why are some societies more religious than others? Is it because of stress?
That's one explanation why some societies are more religious than others. Yeah, so there's stress is one reason, because what matters when you use your, well, it makes people use their religion stronger if they have, if they're faced with adversity in their lives. People tend to use one's religion more strongly. It's not so much that people who don't belong to a religion, who, for example, atheists, they don't suddenly take up religion when they are stressed. They use other coping tools. But people who already belong to a religion, it's like in their toolbox, they have religion, which they can then, they also have, well, talking to your spouse or stuff like that. But religion is one tool in their toolbox, and they can use that when faced with stress.
And what about natural disasters? Are countries that are highly susceptible to natural disasters more religious?
Yes, they are. So that's another study of mine where I try to see whether stress and adversity and shocks increase religiosity causally. And there I can then see, I combine data on surveys. People are surveyed in different points in time across the entire globe. And I can then see if an earthquake hit in between these surveys. I can see whether religiosity is affected. And indeed, it's really the case that these societies hit by an earthquake, religiosity increases.
All right, Jeanette. Now we can shed some light on adverse life events like heart problems and cancer. Are those people more likely to be religious?
Yes, they are. So psychologists have looked at the religiosity of people in hospitals, and they see that that people hit by such dramatic illness, like cancer, are more religious. The problem, though, is that these are correlations. So it's unclear whether other factors maybe have influenced the choices people make in their lives, and their risk of getting various diseases. We don't know from these studies.
All right. Jeanette, it appears that religious people, they tend to repose confidence in the supernatural, whereas non-religious people repose confidence in legitimate state authorities or private authorities such as NGOs or voluntary groups.
There
People,
could,
yes,
yeah.
people like to bond, and one way to bond if you are not a religious person is via philosophies or social groups.
Yes, that is certainly one hypothesis that yeah, that could be tested. Yes.
So, Jeanette, as someone who specializes in religion, would you say that on average it is a plus for society?
That's a very difficult question. Depends on which dimension you look at. So if you look at the hard economic outcomes like innovation or per capita GDP growth or education, it seems that religiosity is a bad thing for society. These more religious societies, they innovate less, they become poorer, they're less educated, which are all things that tap into economic growth. But on the other hand, having this extra tool in your coping box is good for your mental health. So it seems that these societies that are more religious are maybe there is actually a study showing that they are happier. So that could be a way of summarizing this very big literature.
Well, in your article, Why Are Some Societies More Religious? You write, Jeanet, empirical evidence suggests that religiosity may be such a trait. Religion is likely to improve mental health, life satisfaction, abilities to cope with adverse life events, and deter deviant behavior.
Yes, exactly. So that's some of the positive effects on our well-being, like our mental health. It seems to so the literature has shown that religion has this positive effect on our mental health, but this negative effect on more hardcore economic outcomes. Yes.
And then there's also the studies of Robert Woodbury, arguing that there's a positive relationship between Protestantism and development in the developing world.
Yes, so let me stress what I just said was about religiosity, and that's the degree of believing. There's a big other literature on Protestantism, which includes lots of research on showing that Protestant areas tend to be richer than non-Protestant areas for various different reasons. Well, one is maybe Max Weber, others is, for example, education by Sasha Becker and Ludger Bussmann, who had a paper on that. So it's a very, it's crucial that you mentioned that right now. So yes, Protestantism seems to have, Protestant areas seem to be richer than others. Yes.
Yes, because Protestantism encourages individualism, and individualism is the most robust cultural predictor of economic performance.
Yes, maybe.
Yeah, yes, I think that many of the I think that many of the positive consequences of individualism are linked, sorry, of Protestantism are linked to individualism. Because
Okay.
Protestantism as a philosophical doctrine, it is actually faith-based and a bit anti-philosophical. So when you compare the medieval philosophers, they engage in the rigorous analysis of philosophy and religion, whereas people like Calvin and Martin Luther were more than familiar with systematic philosophy, but they were also a bit faith-based and could be mystical. So when I was younger and people said that Protestantism led to science, I often ask, oh, because reading Luther and Calvin, they sound draconian and faith-based.
Yes. I
Yes.
think that's an interesting story.
Yeah, well, Jeanet, it's an interesting story, but it's still speculative. And you're a scholar, so why don't you study the topic?
Yes, well, good idea.
Yeah,
I'll write it down.
I think it's a great idea. It's like your study of the Cistercian monks. The medieval scholastics and intellectuals were not dumb. They were actually more intellectual than we assume. And we're both agreeing that Protestantism as a doctrine is a bit faith-based and mystical. So if Protestantism is faith-based and mystical, and the medieval scholastics were more analytical, why did Protestantism lead to science and not medieval scholasticism? Maybe it's because of individualism.
Yeah, so yeah, I certainly agree that the ancient scholars were very clever people, and I admire them, and I love to test their hypotheses.
Like Max Weber. Max Weber is a genius.
Yeah, and we also tested Wittfogel. Well, that's not that far back, but yes, I really find it so fun to test some of these old philosophers. And but when I say test, I just want to clarify because the thing is that these testing, when I say that, it means, well, testing the generalizability of these theories here, because maybe the theories cannot be generalized to the entire world. Maybe they're strongest or hold exclusively for different parts of the globe. And I think that's where our modern, our ability to use all these fascinating data that's been constructed and is still being constructed across the globe. That way we can test these old theories, test their generalizability. And that's what I find very fascinating.
But even Weber identified the nuances of his theories. That's why it's so compelling.
Yeah, so unfortunately the empirical background of his theory is quite weak when we look at modern eyes, when we look from our ability to do econometrics with large data sets. So his empirics relied well, I don't remember the completely specific data that he had, but one data was that he could look at in his classes that he taught, and he could see some measures of Protestants and Catholics and see whether they had certain economic outcomes. And so that's a very, very narrow and specific data sets of quite few observations. And when we find data sets like that today, we would like to see whether that holds for other areas as well. And then he also observed that Protestant countries were richer than Catholic countries. But the thing is that when we compare countries, they can differ in so many different dimensions, and therefore we need the modern techniques to try to account for that. For example, the Protestant areas also happened to be closer to the Atlantic Ocean, which we know that was a big factor in whether or not you got rich in the past, and so on. Yeah.
And then remember, Catholic Spain was a mercantilist empire. Mercantilism is not a favorable predictor of long-term development.
True.
Yeah, so maybe the Catholic eras were engaged in extractive activities for a longer duration.
Maybe, or maybe this was the countries that were autocratic for other reasons and not because of Protestantism, Catholicism. So that's what the research is really trying to disentangle these different effects today.
Jeanet, you are a Danish economist, and for some time now on my show, I've been saying to my guests, when are we going to get a book titled Getting to Denmark? How to Get There? Well, that's a very sloppy title, but it's just off the bat of my head. But Jeanet, how do countries get to Denmark?
Well, wow.
Yeah, it's a difficult question, but you're from Denmark, another Danish citizen. How do get to Denmark?
I don't know whether countries want to get to Denmark. I mean, I guess with all countries, there's good dimensions and bad dimensions, and well, some dimensions of Denmark are good, and some are not good. Yeah, so if you're talking about the welfare state in Denmark, I have a colleague who did some really fun research on why we have this welfare state in Denmark and also in other Nordic countries. And what she finds is that it's actually because all our individualists, they moved to the US back in the days in the 1900s. They were the ones who wanted to explore the world, and what was left in our Nordic countries, that was all the collectivists who constructed the welfare state. Yeah, it's Anne-Sophie Bech-Knudsen who did this work, and it's really quite fun.
Yeah, but
yeah.
a counter argument is that when we measure the respondent from Denmark using the World Values Survey, relatively they're quite individualistic.
Yes, well, yes, relatively, but not relative, for
To the
example, to the
US.
US, I would expect. Yeah, and I'm not sure, are they also relative to the rest of Europe?
Okay, if it is relative to the US, well, relative to the rest of Europe, that's a different issue. So the US and England are fairly individualistic, and then on the spectrum, individualism becomes more diluted. But as a bloc, Europeans are quite individualistic.
Yes, yes, I would expect. Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, I found that fun.
Yeah. So, but there's actually a paper, Jeanette, and I should have looked up the name of the writer before coming to the show, but I wasn't planning to talk about it. But there's actually a paper arguing that Scandinavian countries are individualistic, and the proof of this is the welfare state, because the welfare state insulates them from the indignity of relying on their neighbor.
Yes, but I think there may be a reversal over time. So now we're just talking hypotheses, okay? So there may be a reversal that, well, if the individualists moved out in the big migration waves, well, then we constructed these institutions based on collectivistic values, and then later on we could then become more individualistic, even more in these societies. But yeah, that's a hypothesis, and it's actually related to a hypothesis by evolutionary psychologist Ara Norensayan,
Yes,
and
I
lots
like
of
Everdim.
yeah. He has this cool hypothesis that, well, back in ancient times, maybe religion or beliefs in high gods were
Yeah.
crucial for developing these institutions, these strong institutions, and could then these societies with where people believed in high gods punishing misbehavior, they behaved well and they developed into big societies. But then later on, these societies developed the good institutions that could then end up replacing religion. And we actually see that these societies are then today those that are less religious. So we see these reversals in history.
There are some counter arguments posited by Harvey Whitehouse and Edward Dutton, and they are criticizing the thesis that that high God religions led to civilizations, because that's another aspect of his thesis, that moralizing religions created civilization.
Yes, and yeah, there is a big debate between those guys. Then the other authors, Lauren Sion and guys, they have actually replied to that and saying that this is just some treatment of missing values in the data set, which creates this adverse effect. So yeah, but
Narenzan responded. So RV Whitehouse published a critique and there was a response, but RV Whitehouse published another critique where he incorporated some of the criticisms. So it's an ongoing debate.
It is, yes, and we will see how it. But I think that this topic is extremely important and so fun, and we will see much more research on that,
Yeah.
and also by other scholars, not just by that debate. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is the last paper we're going to talk about, Jeanette. COVID-19. COVID-19 is intensifying religiosity globally. Is this true? What is going on? Are people becoming more religious because of the stress induced by COVID-19?
Yes, they are, for sure. So I engaged in that research. Well, in March 2020, I was. And I remember I was actually on a radio show where they asked me, that was on, I think it was on March 2nd, they asked me whether COVID-19 would increase religiosity. And I had checked because I had the hypothesis and I could see in the data that it did not. yet increase religiosity. But then I checked in every week and I could see it steadily increasing. Yeah, for that research, I didn't have surveys of people's religiosity or tendency to pray, but I could use Google Trends, where I could see what people were Googling for. This is a really cool database. So what I find is that people Google prayer and other religious terms much more during COVID-19. Of course, they Google anything more because they were in lockdown. But as a share of total Google searches, they Googled prayer more, and much more in the beginning. So in March and April, it increased by I think 30% compared to the year before. But throughout 2020, these Google searches for prayer continued to be 10% higher than previous years.
And this is occurring across the globe, or is it just in some countries?
So this is occurring across the globe, and I've checked whether it's mainly occurring in poorer states or with weaker institutions or higher insecurity and all these things. And it is true that it's occurring more in poorer and more insecure and so on, but it's only because these countries are more religious. So when I account for previous religiosity, there is no difference between the tendency to pray during COVID-19 in poor, rich, and strong institutions or not. And so that was a long way of saying that people tend to pray more during COVID-19, but even more when they are more religious, of course. And actually, for the 10% least religious countries in the world, they don't tend to pray more. And Denmark is one of them. So we are one of the outliers in Denmark.
Okay. Are you religious, Jeanet?
I'm not religious, no.
Okay, I'm slightly religious.
You're slightly religious, yes.
Yeah, I'm religious.
Cool. Yeah.
But Jeanet, unfortunately, I have to wrap up, although I'm enjoying the conversation and I can see you are loving it.
Yes.
Yes,
I do.
yeah, you're loving it because I
Well,
guess most of your interviews are not academic.
Yeah, that's true.
And you have to dilute the information, but in this interview, you can be as academic as you would like.
Yeah. Well, it was fun.
Yes, all right. Bye, Jeanet.
Bye, Lipton.
All right, then.